All right, so provided you all understand algebraic notation, you should be able to follow along with this annotation. I can give some explanation as to a tournament game I played here in Springfield a couple years ago. It looks like March 3rd, 2018, against a youth named Pragyan Misra in the David Moat Memorial. This was round one. I was playing on board 2 in the open section. And we begin in Sicilian defense with the usual e4, c5, knight f3, knight c6, and Pragyan decides to play b3, preparing to fianchetto his bishop, which is a little unusual down the side of the board there, aiming at the middle. So I decided to play a stonewall defense and develop my pawn to e5. He plays bishop b2, fianchettoing the bishop, and I play d6 to fortify that stone wall idea. He then plays h3. I follow with bishop e6. He develops his white squared bishop to e2. I play knight h6. A little bit of different idea here. I don't usually play like this, so in this case I thought it was a good idea. I could develop that pawn to f5 and have a good attack towards the center with my knight on h6 also aiming on f5. He then castles and I play f5. He plays d3 and I bring my queen in to join the attack there in f6. He then plays knight c3 and I play bishop e7. He plays queen d2, and I play queen g6. He then plays king over to h2, and I castle. Now having the rook, the queen, the knight, and the pawn all hitting there on the f5 square. So he brings his rook over to g1, where his king was. I play a6. He moves his knight into d5 in the center. I drop my bishop back to d8 to preserve it for later. He brings his queen into e3. And I play bishop takes knight. He takes pawn, takes bishop, and I bring my knight into b4. He brings his queen over to d2. I play knight takes the d pawn in the center. He then plays d4, and I play c takes d. He brings his bishop to c4, pinning my knight to my king there in the center. So I bring my queen to e6. He then plays c3, trying to break that open in tandem with his queen. So I play b5, forcing him to make the exchange now with the bishop takes knight. My queen covers with his bishop. He then takes c takes d. And I instead pushed past with my e4, leaving his isolated pawn in the center there to act as sort of a blockade. I can set up behind it. He drops his knight back to e1. I play rook to c8 now to the open file. He plays f3. I push past with my f4, I'm also approaching him, I should say. He then plays f takes e, and I take back the e pawn with my queen. And he promotes his knight up to where his pawn was on f3. Now I play my knight up to f5, and he moves his rook on his A file to e1, attacking my queen, so I promote my knight now to e3 to act as a blocking mechanism So he plays bishop a3, attacking my pawn in the center of the board. I promote my rook pretty aggressively up to c2. So you can see if you look at this closely, I've got my knight, my queen, and my rook all aiming at that g2 square where his king is, right in front of his king. So he didn't feel like he was had much choice. He probably did the right thing here by taking my rook with his queen. I recover his queen with mine. And then he takes the center pawn with his bishop. I move my rook over and he takes the other pawn with his bishop on the f. So he's got two pawns now with the rook. I then play queen f5, forcing his bishop to take the knight. My rook takes his bishop. And here is where it gets a little hazy. If you follow this through, you can see it. But according to the paperwork here, there's a move or two in here missing where I check his king, take his rook, and his king moves around. He also moves his rook over in front of my queen, you'll see, forcing me out of the way. And when his rook drops back on the back rank, he checks my king and takes my bishop. But unfortunately, after he does so, I then have a series of two checks with my queen, which forces him to drop his rook. So he ends up, as you can see there at the end, he ended up with a couple of bad shots, and I ended up winning that one. There was nothing you could do after you're missing your rook and the other opponent's got a queen. That's gonna be it. So hope you enjoyed that.